good afternoon. Thank you, Antonio, for your very interesting presentation. And we now have to move on. But actually, we're going to stay with the topic of Detroit. So let me welcome our next speaker, which is Andrew Herscher. Andrew is an associate professor at the University of Michigan, and also he's currently a Creative Cities Fellow at the Stanford Arts Institute. Andrew's work explores really a broad range of topics, so I can only, give you a very brief, some brief examples. So he explores questions around spatial politics of violence, humanitarian and human rights issues, questions of exile, migration, also cultural memory and collective identity. And there he also had a strong, involvement in the context of the breakup of former Yugoslavia. But Andrew is also dealing with questions of urban decline, and on the example also of Detroit. And there he has also been involved in a lot of collaborative projects. And amongst others, one project is, for example, Detroit's Unreal Estate Agency. And it's an open access platform where the members of the platform also study urban crisis and they share it, so it's open access. And then also he's a member of the collective Detroit Resists. And Detroit Resists, it's a cross-disciplinary collective, and it actually came together to respond on the exhibition that is currently being displayed at the Venice Architecture Biennial in this year. So I guess some of you have been at the exhibition in Venice and they saw it. So, it displays visions of architectural offices from across the United States, and their, visions of how to revitalize the city of Detroit, like, how to revitalize this, ghost city. And so the group Detroit Resists came together to actually portray an alternative story, or an alternative narrative actually to the one that is dominant right now, also as we've heard already from Antonio. So rather than Detroit just being about shrinking city, high unemployment, and all those things that are associated with a deindustrialized city, they actually try to provide an alternative image. And I'm not gonna take away too much now, because Andrew will talk about it in a minute. And now I would like really everyone to give a big welcome to Andrew, who actually just arrived 1 hour ago straight from San Francisco. So welcome.
Thank you, Christina, for a very nice introduction. Thank you, Brigitte, for a very nice invitation to Detroit Resists to come here. Thanks to all of you for sticking around. I just got here, as Christina said, but I have a sense this was a long day. A lot of words were probably spoken from this side of the room and listened to from that side of the room, so I want to give you proper respect for hanging in there and still being here. I also want to say one other thing, which is that Detroit Resists has inhabited a number of art spaces and education spaces, but we've never had permission to do it before this moment. This is the first time we've occupied a space in response to an invitation. And we were able to accept Brigitte's very kind invitation because we identified with the ambitions and the kind of framings of the social design program here, which is to say, and maybe it is worth saying, that educational spaces are not neutral platforms for the investigation of all thoughts whatsoever. They're as politically saturated as any other spaces. And so we identified with your saturation, and this is why I'm here today. Detroit Resists is a name. It's the name of a coalition. It's a coalition of artists, activists, and architects who are working on behalf of an inclusive, equitable, and democratic city in Detroit. I'm part of this coalition, and I'm representing this coalition here. But Detroit Resists is also a statement, and it's a statement that describes the response of indigenous communities in Detroit to their displacement from the very city that they built by their labor, that they built by their culture, that they built by their commitments and their desires. So what I want to do today, and I'm going to try and do this very concisely and briefly, is to tell you about the work of our coalition, Detroit Resists, which came out of resistance to one particular project, but also to try to tell you a little bit about how our resistance to this one particular project connects to a much larger tradition of resistance in Detroit. And before I begin, I want to say one other thing, which is I'm not here to say or to try to tell you or convince you that art and architecture and design can find some sort of truth or legitimacy or authenticity by identifying with the desires or identities of a community, be that community indigenous or otherwise. I'm here to say something else, which is that art and architecture and design might very usefully replace the ambition of truth-seeking with solidarity-making. In other words, that instead of trying to speak artistically or architecturally truth to power, art and architecture might seek to speak in solidarity with those resisting power, and to do so in order to strengthen resistance, to advance a counter-politics, and maybe ultimately to work to make the city more habitable to all, which is a topic that I think we're all gathered here today to talk about. I don't need that. Uh-huh. So a year and a half ago, this was the summer of 2015, an announcement was made by the U.S. State Department that the U.S. Pavilion in the 2016 Venice Biennale of Architecture would be dedicated to the theme of the architectural imagination. And you're looking at the website of this year's U.S. Pavilion in this image right here. There are two curators of this pavilion. One of the curators is the dean of the Princeton University School of Architecture. The other curator is the editor of a New York-based architectural journal. And what the curators said when they announced the U.S. Pavilion's theme was that they would explore this theme by commissioning what they called speculative architectural projects from what they called visionary American architectural practices for what they called specific sites in the city of Detroit. Why Detroit? Well, according to the curators, Detroit was a very challenged city. And so as a challenged city, it was a city that offered all sorts of tremendous opportunities to, and these are the words of the curators, to demonstrate the power of architecture to address the social and environmental issues of the 21st century. When we read that, we did not see the power of architecture nearly as positively as the curators did. We understand the power of architecture to have been vividly demonstrated in the course of recent history, in the context of development, modernization, progress, as a kind of recruitment of architecture against indigenous people, against marginalized populations, against precarious communities all across the globe. In fact, we, to some degree, see the history of modern architecture as a history of this recruitment of architecture against the impoverished and all the violence that ensues from that recruitment. And so, for us, the benefit of demonstrating the power of architecture in Detroit was not at all obvious. And in fact, we saw the power of architecture being demonstrated all around us in Detroit. We saw the power of architecture demonstrated as the city was demolishing tens of thousands of what they call blighted houses at the very moment when there's an acute need for affordable housing in Detroit. We saw the power of architecture being demonstrated as tens of thousands of mostly working-class African-American families were being evicted from their houses so that these houses could be sold to investors who would then resell these houses to gentrifying members of the creative class. We saw the power of architecture demonstrated with the water shutoffs that Antonia was just talking about. These water shutoffs were and are affecting tens of thousands of households, primarily households of working class African American families who are unable to pay unaffordable water bills, and these water shutoffs then displace these families and destroy neighborhoods. And so for us, if all these things don't demonstrate the power of architecture, then we don't know what does. And so for us, the power of architecture is not necessarily something to celebrate. It's something that has to be analyzed. It's something that has to be interpreted. In some cases, it's something that has to be protested and even resisted. And so for us, the choice of a city structured by inequalities and disadvantages like Detroit as a place to demonstrate the power of architecture, is that better? Is a very problematic one. It's a proposition that harkens back to a very long colonial history in which the colonial city was basically enlisted as a place to sort of do research for the benefit of various sorts of disciplines and knowledge practices. So we were interested in how an attempt to celebrate the power of architecture in Detroit aligned with all of those ongoing attempts to displace African American communities in the city. We wondered what sort of relationship would emerge between the projects that would be exhibited in the U.S. Pavilion and this ongoing catastrophe that many of Detroit's residents were and are trying to survive. And we feared that the U.S. Pavilion, as a demonstration of the power of architecture, would be unable to engage that catastrophe and would collaborate in this ongoing destruction of the city. And so we wrote a statement that raised those questions and that expressed those concerns. And we made a website, a Twitter account, and a Facebook page, and we posted this statement on all those places. And in doing so, what we were trying to leverage the very different possibilities of accessing physical space in the city and digital space online. Now, access to physical spaces, especially very, very, very prominent physical spaces like the U.S. Pavilion in the Venice Biennale, is access that depends, of course, on wealth, on privilege, on power, and many other resources besides. But access to digital space is structured by very different parameters. So by putting our critique of the U.S. Pavilion on the web, we initiated a process of trying to investigate and exploit the very different ways in which digital space allows texts and images and political claims to be presented and circulated, texts and images and claims that would be inadmissible in physical space. And we also began to explore the kinds of intersections between digital space and physical space. So we encouraged students to download a PDF of our open statement. We encouraged them to print this statement and post it in the hallways and studios of their schools, and you're looking at images of that here. We encouraged students to send us images of our statement posted in their schools so we could post them online and in a sense consolidate a kind of online community of resistance. And Detroit Resists continued to respond to the curators as in the build-up to the Venice Biennale, they advertised their projects in various ways. So for example, when the curators announced a lecture series that was called Detroit 101, this was a lecture series held at the Princeton University School of Architecture, we created a reading list called Detroit 102. That was a critique of the kind of creative class narrative of urban change in Detroit 101. And also a kind of a critique of this notion of art and architecture as kind of uncontroversial social goods as opposed to being sites of political contestation and political instruments. And one of our allies then posted the readings for our reading list on an online library that facilitates the free sharing of intellectual labor. So that in a way, this became the kind of basis for any number of seminars and discussions. We also critiqued the way the U.S. Pavilion presented a mural painted by the radical Mexican artist Diego Rivera in the 1930s in the Detroit Institute of Arts. This mural is one of the most important works of art in the city, and you see it here presented on the website of the U.S. Pavilion. But all you see here is one part of the mural, and it's the part of the mural that shows this kind of happy collaboration between black bodies, brown bodies, and white bodies on the assembly line of Henry Ford's automobile assembly plant. Now, in fact, this mural is much bigger, and you see a piece of it right here. The website crops out the rest of the mural, which shows in very vivid and compelling ways the way that collaboration on the assembly line depends on a kind of colonial extraction of labor and resources, which creates enormous pain and suffering to black and brown bodies in faraway lands. This was an omission that for us spoke to a kind of parallel omission in the curator's Biennale project, and it's an omission of how capitalism extracts surplus value from reserve labor and produces cities and produces societies that are structured by inequality, inequalities based on race and inequalities based on class. But we were not only critiquing inequality, we were working within inequality. And so we were sitting in and around Detroit facing the challenge of how, with absolutely no resources, we could contest possibly the U.S. Pavilion exhibition in Venice itself. And our solution to this was to carry out a digital occupation of the U.S. Pavilion using augmented reality. Now, in the last summer, augmented reality has become extremely familiar to many, many audiences across the globe through Pokemon Go, which I suspect all of you are familiar with. Pokemon Go uses augmented reality to supplement urban reality for entertainment and recreation, which is to say, what Pokemon Go does is it transforms free time into a kind of depoliticized leisure time. But augmented reality can do many, many other things. And in fact, we think it has a very specific political potential, which is augmented reality can introduce images, ideas, and political claims into spaces where precisely those images, ideas, and political claims are prohibited or repressed or denied. In other words, augmented reality allows for a virtual occupation of a physical space that can contest the ownership of that space, the laws controlling that space, the policing of that space, the hegemonic ideologies about how that space should be used. And so we saw augmented reality as offering much, much more than Pokemon Go offers. We saw it as actually offering a possibility to advance a new right to the city. And that's what we tried to take advantage of in our digital occupation of the U.S. Pavilion. And so if you go to the U.S. Pavilion in Venice, which is still up until the end of November, you have two possibilities. One possibility is you can enter the pavilion, which you see here. You can read the introduction to the exhibition, and you can explore the various speculative architectural projects for Detroit that this group of 12 visionary architects produced that demonstrate the power of architecture in Detroit. But you also have another possibility. You can find one of the catalogs or postcards that we sent to Venice. You can scan a QR code that you can find on the back of the catalog, as you see here, or on our postcard. You can download an app, and you can use that app to view our digital occupation of the U.S. Pavilion. And you see a map of the digital occupation here. And what I want to focus your attention on are the three architectural projects we feature in the digital exhibition. One of those projects is a fence that was built by community members to defend a woman who's being threatened with eviction from her home. And now a digital image of that fence runs through the U.S. Pavilion. A second is a protest against water shutoffs that was carried out by an activist group in Detroit. And now a digital image of a sign from that protest is visible in the US Pavilion. And third is the water tower that Antonio just presented to you that Raise Up painted to protest water privatization. And now a digital image of that water tower is in the courtyard of the US Pavilion. And Detroit Resists also left a number of digital tags throughout the US Pavilion to reveal that the space of the US Pavilion was in fact a contested space, just like the space of Detroit itself. So, what does this all mean? Well, if the US Pavilion appropriated Detroit as a kind of blank canvas on which the discipline of architecture could demonstrate its power and investigate its future, Detroit Resists appropriated the US Pavilion as a platform to uplift Detroit's architecture of resistance. And in doing this, and this is where I think I want to conclude, on one level, we were trying to advance a claim about the digital. This idea that digital space is not only a space of play and profit, but also a space of survival and resistance. But ultimately, we're less interested in the digital than the political. And our politics, as I tried to say, are politics of solidarity. If there's a thesis in those politics, it's that art and architecture might only be able to decolonize themselves and democratize themselves in solidarity with movement-based activism, if that activism is the primary site of emancipatory politics in the historical moment that we occupy. And we think that that might indeed be the case. Let me conclude with those words and invite you to share any of your words with any of us right now. Thank you.